The candles had barely been lit when Damien Cross felt his entire world tilt sideways. He was seated at the best table in the restaurant, his fingers wrapped loosely around a glass of wine, his fiancée Vittoria laughing softly at something he had said only moments before. Then a woman stepped out from the kitchen doors carrying 2 plates balanced expertly on her arms, and every sound in the room seemed to disappear. Elena. He would have known her anywhere. The way she moved, quick and graceful even while carrying too much weight. The way a strand of dark hair always slipped free from behind her ear, no matter how carefully she pinned it back. 2 years had passed since he had last seen her face, since the morning she left their apartment with 2 suitcases, and a heart he had broken beyond repair, or so he had believed at the time. Now she stood only a few tables away, wearing a black apron over a fitted uniform, her stomach clearly rounded with the unmistakable shape of pregnancy. Damien set his glass down too hard. The clink against the table drew Vittoria's attention. "Is something wrong?" she asked, tilting her head, dark curls falling over one shoulder. "No," he said, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Nothing." He watched Elena deliver the plates to a nearby table, watched her smile politely at the customers there, a professional smile that never once suggested the storm that must have been building behind her eyes the moment she recognized him. Because she had recognized him. He saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened, in the way her hand trembled slightly as she set down a glass of water. She was pregnant, visibly, unmistakably pregnant, likely 7 or maybe 8 months along. The math ran through his mind in a frantic loop. 2 years since the divorce. 2 years since she had walked away insisting she never wanted to see him again, that his family had ruined everything worth saving between them. If the timeline held, this child could not be his, should not be his. And yet something cold and unfamiliar twisted in his chest at the thought that another man had built a life with her, had given her the family they once dreamed about together during quiet nights when the weight of his empire didn't reach their bedroom. "Damien." Vittoria's voice pulled him back again. "You've gone somewhere else entirely." He forced a smile, the same practiced expression he used in boardrooms and back-alley negotiations, the one that revealed nothing. "Just thinking about work," he said. "I'm sorry, tonight is about us." Vittoria reached across the table and took his hand, her engagement ring catching the low light. She was beautiful, composed, exactly the kind of partner his family had always wanted for him. Their families had known each other for years, their fortunes intertwined through decades of careful alliances. Marrying her would cement power in ways that mattered to everyone except, he was beginning to realize with unsettling clarity, himself. The waiter assigned to their table approached to take their order, a young man with an easy smile, but Damien barely registered a word he said. His eyes kept drifting toward the far side of the restaurant, where Elena moved between tables, her hand occasionally pressing against the small of her back, the way pregnant women often did when the ache of carrying extra weight became too much to ignore. He remembered a version of her from years ago, laughing in the kitchen of their first apartment, flour dusted across her cheek as she attempted to bake a cake for his birthday, and burned it twice before finally getting it right. He remembered the way she used to fall asleep, with her hand resting against his chest, how she never once cared about his money or his name, only about him. Then his father had entered the picture, and everything unraveled. "Sir?" The waiter was still standing there, pen poised over his notepad. "I'll have the salmon," Damien said quickly, though he had no memory of glancing at the menu. Vittoria ordered next, something with a French name he didn't catch, and the waiter disappeared toward the kitchen. Damien's gaze followed him briefly, before sliding back to Elena, who had moved to a station near the bar to prepare drinks for another table. She looked thinner in the face than he remembered, tired in a way that worried him, despite every reason he had to feel nothing toward her anymore. "You keep looking over there," Vittoria said, her tone carefully neutral, though he could hear the edge beneath it. "Do you know that waitress?" The question landed like a blade between his ribs. He considered lying, considered brushing it off with some easy excuse about mistaking her for someone else, but 2 years of running an empire built on half-truths and careful manipulation had taught him that the smallest lies often cause the largest collapses. "She looks familiar," he said instead, choosing the safest version of the truth. "I think we may have crossed paths a long time ago." Vittoria studied him for a moment longer than felt comfortable, her sharp eyes missing nothing, before she let the subject drop and returned to describing the vacation she wanted to plan after their wedding. Damien nodded along, offering responses at what he hoped were the right moments, but his mind remained fixed on Elena. He thought about standing up, walking across the restaurant, and demanding answers to the dozen questions clawing their way up his throat. Who was the father of her child? Why was she working as a waitress when he knew for certain she had once dreamed of opening her own small bakery? Where had she been for 2 years, and had she thought of him even once during all that time the way he had thought of her more nights than he cared to admit? But he couldn't do any of that. Not here. Not with Vittoria sitting across from him wearing his ring. Not with his family's reputation resting on the appearance of a perfect engagement dinner. So instead he sat in silence, forcing down bites of food he couldn't taste, while the woman he once called his wife moved gracefully through a room that suddenly felt far too small to contain both their pasts. Halfway through the meal, Elena's path finally crossed directly with their table. She approached with a water pitcher, refilling glasses at the table beside theirs, and for one unbearable second, her eyes met his. Everything in her expression shattered before she rebuilt it into something composed and unreadable. Her hand tightened around the pitcher's handle. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, offering only a brief professional nod before turning away and walking briskly toward the kitchen doors. Damien's chest ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. "You really don't know her?" Vittoria asked again, quieter this time, watching him with an expression that suggested she already suspected the answer was more complicated than he was willing to admit. "It doesn't matter," Damien said, though every part of him screamed otherwise. "Let's finish dinner." But dinner felt endless after that. Every clatter of dishes from the kitchen made him wonder if Elena was back there, hands shaking, trying to process the same impossible reunion he was struggling to make sense of. Every waitress who passed their table made his pulse spike before he confirmed it wasn't her. When the check finally arrived, Damien paid quickly, eager to escape, before his composure cracked entirely. As he helped Vittoria into her coat, he allowed himself one final glance toward the kitchen doors. Elena stood just inside the frame, barely visible through the small window in the door, watching him leave with an expression he couldn't quite read from this distance. Grief, maybe, or fear, or something far more complicated that carried pieces of both. Outside, the night air hit him like a slap of clarity. Vittoria slid her arm through his as they walked toward the car, chatting about wedding venues and guest lists, her voice a distant hum against the roar building in his own head. He needed to know the truth, about the baby, about why Elena had ended up here, waiting tables in a restaurant 3 streets from the neighborhood where their marriage had once flourished. About why fate, or something crueler, had decided to place her back in his path on the exact night he was supposed to be celebrating a future with someone else. As the driver pulled the car away from the curb, Damien glanced back one final time at the glowing restaurant windows. He didn't see Elena again, but he felt her presence lingering behind him like smoke that refused to clear. That night, long after Vittoria had fallen asleep beside him, Damien lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every second of Elena's face when she recognized him. He thought about the divorce papers he had signed with numb hands 2 years ago, the ones his father had pushed across the desk, insisting it was the only way to protect the family's reputation after damaging photographs surfaced, photographs that supposedly proved Damien's unfaithfulness. He had never fully believed the accusations against himself, of course, because he knew he had never betrayed Elena. But convincing her of that truth, after the damage had already been done, after she had already packed her bags and walked out the door believing every manufactured lie his father had orchestrated, had felt impossible. She wouldn't answer his calls. She refused every attempt at explanation. And eventually, exhausted and broken, he had let her go, telling himself it was better this way, that she deserved a life far from the danger and corruption that surrounded his world. Now, staring into the darkness of his bedroom, he wondered if letting her go had been the greatest mistake of his life. He thought about the child growing inside her. A child that couldn't possibly be his, not with the timeline stretched across 2 years of separation, and yet the ache in his chest didn't feel like the ache of a man who had simply crossed paths with an old flame. It felt like grief, for a family that should have belonged to him and never would. By morning, Damien had made a decision. He needed to see her again, not for closure, not for some polite conversation to settle old business, but because he needed to understand what had truly happened to the woman he had once loved more than anything in the world, and why fate had chosen this particular night to bring her back into his life. He dressed quickly, told his assistant to clear his morning schedule, and left the house before Vittoria had even woken. The restaurant wouldn't open for hours, but he remembered enough about Elena's habits to guess she might already be there, preparing for the day ahead, in the quiet hours before customers arrived. As his car pulled up outside the restaurant, he saw her standing near the side entrance, wrapped in a thin coat against the morning chill, staring out at the empty street, as though waiting for someone. When she turned and saw him stepping out of the car, her expression hardened instantly into something guarded and defensive. "You shouldn't be here," she said before he could speak, her voice carrying none of the warmth he remembered from their years together. "Whatever you came to say, I don't want to hear it." Damien stopped a few feet away, his hands raised slightly in a gesture meant to show he wasn't there to cause trouble. "Elena, please, I just need 5 minutes." Her hand drifted protectively over her stomach, and something in her eyes flickered, uncertain and afraid. "5 minutes," she said finally, her jaw tight. "And then you walk away and never come back." He nodded, though something deep inside him already knew that promise would be impossible to keep. Whatever answers waited for him in the next 5 minutes, he understood with sudden and terrifying clarity that his life, and everything he had built around it, was about to change forever. The street around them stayed quiet, empty of the usual morning traffic, leaving only the sound of Elena's uneven breathing and the distant hum of the city waking up. Damien studied her face, searching for some remnant of the woman who used to fall asleep against his shoulder, and found instead a stranger hardened by 2 years of surviving without him. "Why are you working here?" he asked finally, unable to hold back the question any longer. "You used to talk about opening your own bakery. What happened to that dream?" Elena's laugh came out sharp and humorless. "Dreams cost money, Damien. Money I didn't have after I left everything behind, including the life your family made sure to destroy." "That's not fair," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I never wanted any of that to happen." "Didn't you?" Her eyes flashed with old anger. "You let me walk away believing you had betrayed me. You never once tried to stop me." "I tried everything," Damien said, his voice rising before he forced himself to calm down. "You wouldn't answer my calls. You blocked every number I used. What was I supposed to do?" Elena's expression faltered for just a moment, a crack in the armor she had built so carefully. "It doesn't matter now," she said quietly. "It's been 2 years. We've both moved on." Damien's gaze dropped briefly to her stomach before returning to her face. "Have you moved on, I mean?" Something unreadable passed behind her eyes, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then, just as the silence began to feel unbearable, the restaurant's back door creaked open, and a young man in a chef's uniform stepped out, calling Elena's name. She turned quickly, telling him she would be inside in a moment, before facing Damien one final time. "Your 5 minutes are up," she said, and though her voice remained steady, he could see her hands trembling at her sides. "Please don't come back here." She disappeared through the door before he could respond, leaving him standing alone on the quiet street, with more questions than answers, and a strange, unfamiliar ache settling permanently into his chest. As he walked back toward his car, Damien couldn't shake the feeling that Elena hadn't answered his question at all. She hadn't said yes. She had moved on. She hadn't said no, either. And somewhere beneath the fear and the anger in her eyes, he thought he had glimpsed something else entirely, something that looked remarkably like the woman he used to know, still buried beneath everything life had forced her to become. He climbed into the car and sat in silence as the driver pulled away, his mind already turning toward the one place he knew he needed to go next, if he wanted real answers: his father's office. Because if his instincts were right, and Elena's reaction to seeing him again carried more unresolved history than either of them had admitted out loud, then the lies that tore them apart 2 years ago had never truly been settled. And Damien intended to find out exactly what those lies had cost him, no matter what it meant for the fragile engagement waiting for him at home, or the dangerous truths waiting for him at his father's door. He glanced once more at the restaurant's dark windows before the car turned the corner, half expecting to see Elena watching him from behind the glass. She wasn't there, but the image of her tired eyes stayed with him regardless, refusing to let go. 2 years of silence between them, and yet in the span of a single dinner and a single morning conversation, every wall he had built to survive her absence had already begun to crumble. His phone buzzed against his leg, a message from Vittoria, asking where he had gone so early, and whether he would be home in time for lunch with her parents. He stared at the screen for a long moment, before typing a short reply, telling her something had come up at the office. It wasn't entirely a lie, something had come up, just not the kind he could ever explain to her. The driver asked no questions as they moved through the city streets, weaving past morning traffic toward the tall glass building that housed his family's business empire. Damien barely noticed the familiar route, his thoughts tangled somewhere between the woman he had left behind and the child she now carried, a child whose existence raised more questions than he was prepared to answer. By the time the car pulled up outside his father's private office, Damien had steadied his expression into something calm and unreadable, the same mask he wore into every difficult negotiation. But beneath that mask, a quiet resolve had taken root, one he hadn't felt in years. Whatever his father had done 2 years ago to tear his marriage apart, Damien intended to uncover every detail, no matter how deeply it was buried, and no matter who it might destroy in the process. Marcus Cross sat behind his enormous mahogany desk, reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose, when Damien burst into the office without waiting for permission from the secretary outside. The older man looked up, unbothered by the intrusion, as though he had been expecting this visit for years. "You look upset," Marcus said calmly, setting down the papers in his hand. "Sit down, son." "I'm not sitting," Damien said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth, not another performance." Marcus removed his glasses slowly, folding them with deliberate care, the same practiced patience he used whenever he wanted to unsettle an opponent before a negotiation. "This sounds serious." "Elena," Damien said, watching his father's face carefully for any flicker of reaction. "I saw her last night, she's pregnant." For the briefest moment, something shifted behind Marcus's eyes, so quick that another man might have missed it entirely. But Damien had spent his entire life studying his father's expressions, learning to read the smallest details others overlooked, and he saw it clearly. Surprise, followed almost instantly by careful recalculation. "That's unfortunate for her," Marcus said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "But I don't see what this has to do with me." "Don't," Damien warned, stepping closer to the desk. "Don't pretend you don't know what I'm asking. 2 years ago, you brought me photographs. You told me Elena had been unfaithful, that she was seeing someone else behind my back. You pushed the divorce papers into my hands, before I even had time to think clearly. I protected this family," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "That girl was never suited for our world. She would have made you weak, distracted you from everything that matters." "That's not an answer," Damien said. "Were the photographs real?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Marcus rose slowly from his chair, walking toward the window overlooking the city, his hands clasped behind his back in the same posture Damien had watched him hold during 100 difficult conversations throughout his childhood. "Sometimes," Marcus said finally, "a father has to make difficult choices to protect his son's future. Choices the son isn't always capable of making for himself." Damien felt something cold settle into his stomach. "You lied to me. I did what was necessary." "You destroyed my marriage over lies," Damien said, his voice rising now, echoing off the tall windows of the office. "Elena left, believing I had betrayed her. She spent 2 years alone, struggling, working as a waitress just to survive, while carrying a child that could have been raised in this family if you hadn't torn us apart." Marcus turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "The child isn't yours. The timeline doesn't work." "How would you know the timeline unless you've been watching her?" Damien said, the realization hitting him with sudden clarity. "You've kept tabs on Elena this entire time, haven't you?" His father said nothing, which was answer enough. "Tell me everything," Damien demanded, Right now. Marcus sighed, the sound of a man finally cornered after years of careful maneuvering. The photographs were staged. I paid a woman to pose with you at an event, arranged the timing so it would look convincing from certain angles. Elena's family had accumulated debts I found troubling. I worried she was only interested in your name and your money, that she would eventually become a liability. She never once asked me for anything, Damien said, his voice shaking now with barely restrained fury. In 3 years of marriage, she never once cared about the money. Perhaps, Marcus said, but I couldn't take that risk. This family has enemies who would exploit any weakness, and love makes men weak, Damien. It makes them careless. Damien stared at his father, a man he had respected and feared in equal measure for his entire life, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. The foundation of trust he had built his identity around, however flawed, had just crumbled entirely. You ruined her life, Damien said quietly. You ruined mine. I built an empire for you to inherit, Marcus said, his voice hardening again. An empire that requires sacrifice. You'll understand that better once you're married to Vittoria and running this family yourself. Damien said nothing more. He turned and walked out of the office, ignoring his father's voice calling after him, ignoring the secretary who asked if everything was all right. His hands trembled as he made his way back to the car, rage and grief tangled together into something he couldn't quite name. He needed to see Elena again, not for accusations or explanations this time, but to finally tell her the truth she deserved to hear 2 years ago. The drive back to the restaurant felt longer than it should have, every red light stretching into an eternity of impatience. When he finally arrived, the lunch rush had already begun, customers filling every table, servers moving briskly between kitchen and dining room. He spotted Elena near the back, balancing a tray of drinks with practiced ease, despite the visible strain on her face. He waited near the entrance, unwilling to cause a scene in front of her coworkers, until she finally noticed him standing there. Her expression darkened immediately. I told you not to come back, she said, setting down the tray at an empty station. I know the truth, Damien said quietly, stepping closer so only she could hear him. About the photographs, about everything my father did to tear us apart. Elena's face went pale. What are you talking about? The photographs were staged, he said. My father paid a woman to pose with me. He manipulated the timing, manipulated everything, because he thought you weren't suited for this family. He lied to both of us, Elena. I never betrayed you. For a long moment, Elena said nothing, her hand pressed against the counter, as though she needed the support to stay standing. When she finally spoke, her voice came out barely above a whisper. 2 years, she said. 2 years. I believed you had ruined everything, that you never loved me enough to be faithful. I never stopped loving you, Damien said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Not for a single day. Elena's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, blinking rapidly as she fought to maintain her composure in front of customers who had begun to notice the tension between them. You should go, she said finally. This isn't the place. Then tell me where, Damien said. Tonight, after your shift. I need to talk to you properly, please. She hesitated, torn between the anger she had carried for 2 years and the impossible new truth he had just handed her. Finally she nodded, barely perceptible, before turning and walking quickly toward the kitchen, leaving Damien standing alone amid the noise of the crowded restaurant. He left without another word, his mind racing through everything that needed to happen next. He would need to confront his father formally, perhaps even remove him from certain positions of power within the family business. He would need to figure out how to explain any of this to Vittoria, whose suspicions had already been growing before he had answers to give her. And most importantly, he would need to figure out exactly what role he still had, if any, in Elena's life, and in the life of the child she carried. That evening, Damien arrived at the small apartment building Elena had given him the address to, a modest complex several neighborhoods away from anywhere his family typically operated. He climbed 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding harder with each step, until he found himself standing outside her door. She opened it before he could knock, dressed comfortably now, out of her uniform, one hand resting protectively on her stomach. The apartment behind her was small but tidy, filled with warm light from a single lamp in the corner. "Come in," she said quietly. He stepped inside, glancing around the modest space, noticing the second-hand furniture and the careful way she had made the small apartment feel like a home, despite obviously limited resources. Guilt twisted through him at the thought of how much easier her life could have been if his father hadn't interfered. "I've thought about nothing else since this afternoon," Elena said, gesturing for him to sit on the worn couch while she lowered herself carefully into an armchair across from him. "If what you're saying is true, then everything I believed for 2 years was a lie." "It was," Damien confirmed. "And I'm sorry it took me this long to find out. I should have fought harder back then. I should have never let you walk away without exhausting every possibility to prove my innocence." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture Damien remembered from years ago, whenever she felt overwhelmed or afraid. "I don't know what to do with this information," she admitted. "It doesn't undo 2 years of struggling alone. It doesn't undo the fear I felt every single day, wondering how I would provide for this baby without any support." "Let me help you now," Damien said. "Whatever you need." "I don't need your money," Elena said sharply, old defensiveness flaring instantly. "I've survived this long without it." "That's not what I meant," Damien said gently. "I meant I want to be here. For you. For the baby, if you'll let me." Something in Elena's expression softened slightly, though caution remained evident in every line of her posture. "The baby isn't yours, Damien. You know the timeline doesn't work." "I know," he said, though something uncertain flickered behind his eyes as he said it. "But that doesn't mean I can't be here for you regardless." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of manipulation or hidden motive, before finally allowing herself to relax slightly against the back of her chair. "I need time," she said. "This is a lot to process all at once." "Take whatever time you need," Damien said. "I'm not going anywhere this time." As he left her apartment that night, walking back down the 3 flights of stairs toward his waiting car, Damien felt a strange mixture of relief and dread settling over him. Relief that Elena hadn't shut the door on him entirely. Dread at the conversation he still needed to have with Vittoria, and the reckoning still waiting for him with his father, whose lies had cost them both more than 2 years of their lives. He climbed into the car, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past, and allowed himself, for the first time in 2 years, to imagine a future that included Elena again. But that future felt fragile, threatened on every side by the family and obligations that had torn them apart once already, and Damien understood with growing certainty that protecting whatever chance remained between them would require a fight far more difficult than any he had faced in his father's business. Vittoria was waiting in his living room when he finally returned home, seated stiffly on the edge of the couch with her arms crossed, her expression carved from stone. The moment he walked through the door, he knew the conversation he had been dreading could no longer be postponed. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm. "You disappeared this morning without explanation, missed lunch with my parents, and now it's nearly midnight." Damien set his keys down slowly, choosing his words with care. "I went to see someone from my past, someone I needed to speak with about something important." "The waitress," Vittoria said flatly. It wasn't a question. He nodded, seeing no point in denying it any longer. "Her name is Elena. We were married for 3 years before we divorced 2 years ago." Vittoria's composure cracked slightly, surprise flickering across her face before she rebuilt her expression into something more guarded. "You were married before? Why didn't you ever mention this?" "It's complicated," Damien said, sitting down across from her. "My father orchestrated false accusations against me. He staged photographs that made it look like I had been unfaithful. Elena believed the lies and left before I could prove otherwise." "And you found out about this today?" Vittoria asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "I found out this morning," Damien confirmed. "After seeing her at the restaurant last night, I couldn't stop thinking about why she looked at me the way she did. I confronted my father, and he admitted everything." Vittoria stood abruptly, pacing toward the window, her arms still crossed tightly against her chest. "She's pregnant, Damien. I saw her at the restaurant too, remember. Is the child yours?" "No," Damien said, though the certainty in his own voice felt weaker than he wanted it to. The timeline doesn't work. We divorced 2 years ago. But you still care about her, Vittoria said, turning to face him directly. I can see it. You've cared about her this entire time, haven't you? Even while we've been planning our wedding. Damien hesitated, torn between honesty and the desire to avoid causing more pain than necessary. I never expected to see her again, he said finally. But finding out the truth about what happened between us has changed things. I need to make sure she's all right. I need to understand what happened to her these past 2 years. That's not an answer, Vittoria said, her voice growing sharper. Do you still love her? The question hung in the air between them, heavier than anything either of them had said all evening. Damien opened his mouth to deny it, to offer some reassurance that would smooth over the tension building in the room, but the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere beneath the guilt and the shock of the past 2 days, he already knew the answer, even if he wasn't ready to admit it aloud. I don't know, he said finally, which felt like the only honest thing he could offer. Vittoria's expression shattered for just a moment before she forced it back into composure, walking toward the door and retrieving her coat from where she had left it earlier. I need time to think, she said quietly. This isn't the engagement I agreed to. She left without another word, the sound of the front door closing behind her, echoing through the empty house. Damien sat alone in the silence that followed, the weight of everything that had happened over the past 2 days pressing down on him with suffocating force. Over the following week, Damien found himself splitting his time between managing the fallout with his father's business partners, who had begun to notice the sudden tension within the family, and visiting Elena whenever her schedule allowed. Each visit revealed new layers of the life she had built without him, small details he had missed during their 2 years apart. In had taken evening classes to finish a business certificate she had abandoned years earlier, when they first married. She had made friends among her co-workers, who had become something like a second family during the loneliest stretches of her pregnancy. You've built something real here, Damien said one evening, sitting across from her in the same worn armchair he had grown accustomed to during his visits. Even without any help from me. I had to, Elena said simply. There wasn't another option. He studied her carefully, noticing the way exhaustion had settled permanently beneath her eyes, the way she occasionally winced when the baby shifted inside her. Have you thought any more about letting me help? Not because you need saving, but because I want to be part of this, whatever this ends up looking like. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach. I have thought about it, she admitted, but I'm scared, Damien. Scared of what it means to let you back into my life when your world is still filled with the same danger and manipulation that tore us apart the first time. I'm going to fix that, Damien said, determination hardening his voice. I'm already working on removing my father from certain positions of influence. I want to build something different, something safer, if you're willing to give me the chance to prove it. Before Elena could respond, her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting to something tense and worried. It's my doctor's office, she said, answering quickly. Damien watched her face carefully as she listened, noting the way her brow furrowed with growing concern. When she finally ended the call, her hands were trembling. What is it? He asked immediately. They want me to come in for additional testing, Elena said, her voice unsteady. Something about the baby's measurements not matching up correctly for the timeline they had recorded. They want to run more thorough tests to make sure everything is developing normally. A cold feeling settled into Damien's stomach, an instinct he couldn't quite name yet, but that demanded attention regardless. I'll take you, he said immediately. Whatever you need, I'll be there. Elena nodded, too distracted by worry to argue against his offer this time. As they prepared to leave for the appointment, Damien's mind raced through possibilities he wasn't yet ready to voice aloud, questions about timelines and dates that had been nagging at the edges of his thoughts since the night he first saw her at the restaurant. The clinic felt sterile and cold as they waited in the small examination room. Elena seated on the table, while a doctor reviewed her file with a thoughtful expression. Damien stood near the wall, trying to project calm he didn't fully feel. Based on the growth measurements from the ultrasound, the doctor said finally, the pregnancy appears to be slightly further along than we initially calculated. It's possible the original estimate was inaccurate. Elena's face went pale. How much further along? The doctor reviewed the chart again. Based on these measurements, likely closer to 9 months rather than the 7 or 8 we previously estimated. It's not uncommon for early dating to be slightly off, especially if the initial visit occurred later than ideal. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of medical equipment. Damien felt his pulse pounding in his ears as the doctor's words settled over him, the timeline shifting into something that suddenly aligned far too closely with the last night he and Elena had spent together before their divorce was finalized, a night neither of them had spoken about since. Elena's eyes met his across the small room, wide with the same dawning realization reflected in his own expression. Neither of them said anything as the doctor continued discussing scheduling for the additional testing, the conversation fading into background noise beneath the enormity of what this new information could mean. Once they were alone in the hallway outside the clinic, Elena finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Damien, if the timeline is different than we thought." "I know," he said, his own voice unsteady with a mixture of fear and something that felt dangerously close to hope. "The night before the divorce was finalized, we spent that night together." Elena's hand pressed against her stomach protectively, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't think it was possible. I assumed the dates I had been given were accurate." "We need to know for certain," Damien said gently, though his heart was already racing ahead of logic, already imagining a future he hadn't dared to consider until this exact moment. "Whatever the answer is, we'll face it together." Elena nodded slowly, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in everything she thought she understood about her own pregnancy, about the child she had been preparing to raise entirely alone. As they walked out into the afternoon sunlight together, the weight of this new possibility settled heavily between them, promising to reshape everything that came next, in ways neither of them could yet fully predict. The days leading up to the additional testing felt unbearably long. Damien found himself unable to concentrate on business meetings, his mind constantly drifting toward the possibility that had opened up in that sterile examination room. He visited Elena every evening now, no longer needing an excuse to justify his presence, both of them caught in the strange limbo of waiting for confirmation that could change everything. "I keep trying not to hope," Elena admitted one evening, sitting beside him on her small couch, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. "It's easier to prepare for disappointment than to imagine something might actually go right for once." "I understand," Damien said quietly, though he couldn't quite stop the flicker of hope building steadily in his own chest, despite every attempt to remain cautious. "But whatever happens, I meant what I said. I'm not disappearing from your life again." Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for any hint of insincerity, before finally allowing herself to lean slightly against his shoulder, a small gesture that carried enormous weight given everything that had happened between them. Neither of them spoke for a long while, simply sitting together in comfortable silence for the first time in 2 years. Meanwhile, tension continued building within Damien's family, as word spread about his confrontation with his father. Marcus Cross, unaccustomed to having his authority questioned, began making calls to old business associates, attempting to rally support against what he viewed as his son's reckless behavior threatening the family's carefully built reputation. "You're embarrassing this family," Marcus said, during a tense phone call Damien answered while sitting in his car outside Elena's apartment building. "Chasing after a waitress while your engagement to Vittoria falls apart in front of everyone." "The engagement is falling apart because of lies you told 2 years ago," Damien said, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "Lies that destroyed my marriage and cost Elena 2 years of struggling alone." "I did what was necessary," Marcus repeated, the same tired justification Damien had already heard once before. "And I'll continue doing what's necessary if you insist on threatening this family's stability." The threat hung heavy in his father's tone, unmistakable despite the careful phrasing. Damien ended the call without responding, unwilling to give his father the satisfaction of an argument, though the warning left him unsettled regardless. Word of the situation eventually reached Vittoria, who had been staying with her parents since their tense confrontation the week before. She arrived unannounced at Damien's house one afternoon, her expression a careful mask of controlled anger. "Your father called my mother," Vittoria said without preamble, as Damien led her inside. "He told her everything, about the waitress, about the possibility that the child might be yours after all. Is that true? Damien felt his stomach drop. He hadn't wanted her to learn about the timeline shift this way, hadn't wanted his father weaponizing something so deeply personal to manipulate the situation to his own advantage. We don't know for certain yet, he said carefully. The doctors are running additional tests. But it's possible, Vittoria said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. You've been sneaking off to see her every single day, haven't you? While I've been sitting at home, wondering if our engagement even means anything to you anymore. Vittoria, I'm sorry, Damien said, and he genuinely meant it, though the apology felt inadequate against the magnitude of what he had put her through. None of this is fair to you. You deserve someone who can give you their full attention, their full heart, and I haven't been able to offer that since the moment I saw Elena again. Vittoria's composure finally cracked entirely, tears spilling down her cheeks, despite her obvious effort to hold them back. I've known you for years, Damien. I thought we had something real building between us, even if it started as an arrangement between our families. I actually believed we could make this work. I care about you, Damien said honestly. I do. But what I feel for Elena, what I've always felt for her even during the 2 years we were apart, it's different. It's something I can't ignore anymore, especially not now that I know the truth about what tore us apart in the first place. So that's it then, Vittoria said, wiping angrily at her tears. You're ending our engagement for a woman you haven't seen in 2 years, based on a possibility that hasn't even been confirmed yet. I'm ending our engagement because it wouldn't be fair to either of us to continue pretending, Damien said gently. You deserve someone who loves you completely, not someone whose heart belongs to somebody else. Vittoria stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing his words, before finally removing the engagement ring from her finger and setting it carefully on the table between them. I hope she's worth it, she said quietly, her voice devoid of its earlier anger, replaced instead by a weary sadness. I hope whatever you're chasing brings you the happiness you're looking for. She left without waiting for a response, the front door closing softly behind her this time, lacking the dramatic slam Damien had almost expected. He stood alone in the quiet house, staring at the abandoned ring on the table, feeling the finality of the moment settle over him, along with an unexpected sense of relief that surprised him with its intensity. His phone rang moments later. Elena's name appeared on the screen, and he answered immediately, sensing from some instinct that this call carried significant weight. The test results came back, Elena said, her voice trembling audibly through the phone. Damien, they confirmed it. The baby is yours. The words hit him like a physical force, knocking the breath from his lungs entirely. He sank onto the couch, his hand gripping the phone tightly as emotion flooded through him, overwhelming and impossible to fully process in the moment. Are you certain? He asked finally, needing to hear the confirmation again, despite already believing every word. Completely certain, Elena said. The doctor confirmed the corrected timeline aligns exactly with that last night we spent together. This is your child, Damien. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment to simply feel the full weight of this revelation, joy and fear and overwhelming responsibility tangling together into something he couldn't fully separate. I'm coming over right now, he said. We need to talk about what happens next. Damien, wait, Elena said, before he could hang up, her voice suddenly hesitant. This doesn't erase everything that happened. It doesn't erase 2 years of struggling alone, believing you had betrayed me. I need you to understand that before you come rushing over here, expecting everything to simply fall back into place. I understand completely, Damien said, and he meant every word. I'm not expecting anything from you except the chance to prove, through actions rather than promises, that I intend to be here for both you and our child, no matter how long it takes to rebuild the trust my father's lies destroyed. Elena was quiet for a moment before finally responding, her voice softer now. Come over then, we have a lot to figure out. As Damien drove through the city toward her apartment, the weight of everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks pressed down on him with overwhelming force. His engagement to Vittoria had ended, his relationship with his father had fractured beyond easy repair, and somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, he had discovered he was about to become a father to a child he never expected to have, with a woman he had never truly stopped loving despite every attempt to move forward without her. He arrived at her building and climbed the familiar 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and something that felt remarkably like hope. When Elena opened the door, her eyes still red from crying, he saw something different in her expression this time, something that looked almost like cautious relief breaking through 2 years of carefully guarded defenses. "We're really doing this," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Figuring out how to be parents together, after everything that happened." "We're really doing this," Damien confirmed, following her inside and closing the door behind them, shutting out the chaos of his fractured family and broken engagement, focusing instead on the fragile, precious possibility of the future opening up in front of them both. They spent the following hours talking through practical details, hospital preparations, living arrangements, and the complicated question of how much of Damien's dangerous world he needed to shield from both Elena and their unborn child. But beneath the practical conversation, something deeper had shifted between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that, despite everything that had torn them apart, they were being given an unexpected chance to build something real together again. Late into the evening, as Elena finally succumbed to exhaustion and drifted asleep on the couch beside him, Damien sat quietly watching her, his hand resting gently over hers where it rested against her stomach. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, whatever battles remained with his father and the dangerous world he still needed to navigate, Damien understood with absolute clarity that he would face every single one of them if it meant protecting this fragile new beginning with everything he had. 3 weeks later, Damien stood in the same office where he had confronted his father before, but this time he arrived with a folder of documents under his arm and a resolve that had only strengthened with every passing day. Marcus looked up from his desk, his expression guarded, clearly aware that this visit carried different weight than the emotional confrontation from weeks earlier. "I've spoken with the board," Damien said, setting the folder down on the desk between them. "They've agreed to transfer full operational control to me, effective immediately. Your position moves to an advisory role only, without decision-making authority." Marcus's face hardened. "You can't simply remove me from the company I built." "I can, and I have," Damien said calmly. "The board has seen enough over the past few weeks to understand that your judgment can no longer be trusted with decisions that affect this family's future. Manipulating my marriage, staging false evidence, threatening the woman I love because you decided she wasn't suitable. None of that reflects leadership anyone should continue following blindly." "Everything I did was to protect this family," Marcus insisted, though his voice carried less conviction than it had during their previous confrontation. "You protected your idea of what this family should look like," Damien said, "not the actual people within it. I'm not interested in running this business the way you have, built on manipulation and fear. I'm going to build something different, starting with honesty, even if that means moving slower and taking fewer risks than you're comfortable with." Marcus stared at his son for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that might have been the beginning of genuine reflection, though Damien understood it would likely take considerably longer before any real change took root, if it ever did at all. "And Elena," Marcus said finally, "what happens with her?" "She's carrying my child," Damien said firmly. "A fact you tried to prevent from ever happening by tearing us apart in the first place. I intend to be there for both of them, fully and completely, regardless of whether you approve." Without waiting for further argument, Damien turned and left the office, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that had been pressing down on him for years, long before Elena had even reappeared in his life. Dismantling his father's control over the business felt like the first genuine step toward building the different kind of life he wanted, not just for himself, but for the family he was determined to protect this time. Over the following weeks, Damien worked to restructure the business, implementing changes that moved away from the dangerous, manipulative practices his father had relied upon for decades. It was slow, difficult work, met with resistance from certain business partners accustomed to the old ways of operating, but Damien remained steady in his resolve, understanding that real change rarely came easily. Meanwhile, his relationship with Elena continued rebuilding, slowly and carefully, both of them cautious after everything that had happened between them. He visited every day, helping prepare the nursery in the spare room of her apartment, attending every doctor's appointment, learning again the small details of her life he had missed during their 2 years apart. "You've changed," Elena observed one evening, as they sat together on her couch, her hand resting on her rounded stomach while Damien gently rubbed her feet, a habit he remembered from their years of marriage. "Not just in what you're doing with the business. Something feels different in you." "I've had a lot of time to think," Damien said, "about what actually matters. For years I let my father's definition of success guide every decision I made, and look what it cost us. I'm not interested in repeating those mistakes." Elena studied him carefully, the wariness that had defined her expression for weeks, finally beginning to soften into something warmer. "I want to believe this is real," she admitted. "That you've truly changed, that this isn't just guilt driving your actions right now." "Give me time to prove it," Damien said gently. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely right away. I know that trust has to be rebuilt slowly, through actions rather than promises. I'm prepared for that." As the weeks passed, Damien's consistent presence began to work exactly as he had promised. He never missed an appointment, never broke a commitment, showing up reliably for every small and large moment of Elena's pregnancy, in ways that gradually chipped away at the careful walls she had built around her heart. One evening, nearly full term now, Elena sat across from Damien at a small kitchen table, sharing a simple dinner he had prepared himself, determined to demonstrate through small gestures the kind of partner he intended to become. "I've been thinking," she said, setting down her fork, "about us. About what comes next once the baby arrives." "I've been thinking about that too," Damien admitted. "I know things are still complicated. I know rebuilding what we lost will take time. But I want you to know that whatever pace you need, whatever boundaries feel right for you, I'll respect them completely. I'm not going anywhere." Elena reached across the table, taking his hand in hers, a small gesture that carried enormous significance, given everything they had endured to arrive at this moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm ready to try again. Not rushing back into everything we had before, but building something new, together, one step at a time." Relief and joy flooded through Damien in equal measure, though he kept his response measured, understanding the fragility of the trust they were carefully rebuilding. "One step at a time," he agreed. "I can work with that." 2 weeks later, in the early hours of a quiet morning, Elena went into labor. Damien rushed her to the hospital, staying by her side through every difficult hour that followed, holding her hand and offering steady encouragement as she brought their daughter into the world. When the nurse finally placed the small, crying infant into Elena's arms, Damien felt tears he made no effort to hide, overwhelmed by the culmination of everything they had endured to reach this precise, perfect moment. "She's beautiful," Elena whispered, exhaustion and joy mingling in her voice as she gazed down at their daughter for the first time. "She looks like you," Damien said softly, leaning close to look at the tiny face nestled against Elena's chest. They named her Grace, a name they chose together during one of their quiet evening conversations weeks earlier, symbolizing the unexpected mercy that had brought them back together after everything that had tried to keep them apart. In the months that followed, Damien continued proving himself through steady, consistent actions rather than empty promises. He moved into a modest apartment near Elena's, close enough to be present for every moment of Grace's early life, without pressuring Elena into a faster pace than she felt ready for. He continued restructuring the family business, gradually earning the trust of partners who had initially doubted his ability to lead without his father's more ruthless methods. His relationship with Marcus remained distant and strained, though occasional conversations suggested his father was beginning, slowly and reluctantly, to reflect on the damage his manipulation had caused. Whether that reflection would ever translate into genuine change remained uncertain, but Damien no longer needed his father's approval to guide the decisions he made for his own family. 6 months after Grace's birth, on a quiet evening filled with the soft sounds of their daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, Damien sat with Elena on the small balcony of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker to life as darkness settled over the horizon. "I never imagined we would end up here," Elena said quietly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "After everything that happened, I thought I would spend the rest of my life alone, raising Grace without any help. I'm grateful every single day that fate brought us back together," Damien said, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders. Even if it took a chance encounter at a restaurant to finally expose the truth we both deserved to know from the beginning. Elena smiled softly, tilting her face up toward his. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything they had rebuilt together, piece by careful piece, over the difficult months since that unexpected reunion. "I think some part of me never stopped, even during the years we spent apart." "I love you too," Damien said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "And I promise, for as long as I live, I will never let anything or anyone come between us again." As the stars emerged fully overhead, and the soft sound of their daughter's breathing drifted through the open window behind them, Damien finally understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that everything he had once believed mattered most: the power, the family name, the empire built on fear and manipulation, meant nothing compared to the quiet, precious life he had found his way back to, against every obstacle placed in his path. Together, he and Elena had built something real from the wreckage of lies that once tore them apart, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal, given enough patience, honesty, and unwavering commitment to choosing each other, again and again, one day at a time.